My name's Mavis Souls. I'm the president of Lane County Audubon Society. We're happy to see folks out on this February night when fortunately it's not snowing, it's not raining, and hopefully we won't see any of that for, well, maybe tomorrow, but we've had our share of it, that's for sure. We also have a Zoom audience tuning in with the technology out there, so we're welcoming those folks too. And I wanted to mention Dennis Arndt is not here tonight. He was traveling over the last couple of weeks and came home a bit under the weather, but he just arrived last night. He's fine. He will be fine, but we're missing him here tonight. He might be listening to what I'm saying. So anyway, we do miss him though, because we always enjoy hearing his voice to announce the speaker. We do have one activity announcement we want to tell you about. Barb Bryson will speak to you about a work party we have coming up. If you want to come and speak in the speaker.
Sure. So we have a volunteer outing coming up this next Saturday from 9 to noon. Hopefully it won't rain too much, but we're going to go to Delta Ponds. I'll bet most of you are familiar with Delta Ponds. It's kind of a beloved birding area. And we're going to work on invasive plants because they displace native plants. And we have to do it now because the nesting birds are going to start nesting soon, so we don't want to disturb them. So if you want to come, there's going to be a sign-up sheet. If you don't want to stay 3 hours, you know, anything is great. We're going to be attacking blackberries, which I love, going after blackberries. And I will be bringing cookies. So, you just have to bring yourself and a water bottle and clothes. The city provides tools and gloves, and they'll have a liability waiver to sign. The head ecologist is going to talk to us a little bit, Lori Holtz, and the volunteer, what's her title? Waterways volunteer manager, Kelsey Irvine is going to work with us. So do some good for a place that we care about. And there's also a sign-up sheet in the back if you want to sign up. I'll start it with you.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. I'll begin and announce our speaker. We're very happy to have an ambassador from the Xerces Society, Dave Kollen. He's grew up east of Salem in Mount Angel and lived much of his recent work life in Texas until he retired and he and his wife moved to Brookings 9 years ago. So he's in Oregon again. And as we all know, Oregon's a great place to live. So from a young age, he always loved nature and biology, and he was fascinated by ants and their complex societies. And he's taken on the ambassador for the Xerces Society because he's loves learning as much as possible about bees and pollinators. He's contributed to and I'm sure he'll tell you more about this, I'm losing my place, the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, which is really the main resource for folks who want to learn more about bumblebees in the Pacific Northwest. So we're looking forward to hearing his talk, because we all love to have bees in our native plant gardens. And so Dave, welcome. We're happy to have you here. Thank you.
Good evening. Happy to be here. One other thing, just as a point of reference, I'm also a member of the Oregon Bee Atlas. I'm a certified master melicologist. That's somebody that studies bees. And I do work for the California Bumblebee Atlas also. So let's go ahead and get moving. So the Xerces Society is named after the Xerces blue butterfly. This is the first butterfly that's known to have gone extinct due to habitat loss through development. So man had a hand in this. Last seen flying on the North Peninsula of the San Francisco Bay area in the early 40s. Not seen since then. Those with a keen eye will notice that these are on a pin, It's not the way we really like to see our butterflies, but when they go extinct, this is all that we have left. And so this event really catalyzed some action by a couple of lepidopters, and they formed the Xerces Society 51 years ago. And it started out small, and it's still small. I think less than 100 people, really dedicated individuals working there. And the society is dedicated to conserving invertebrates. So that's any animal without a backbone, with the exception of politicians when you count those. And a lot of work being done. Why do we care about invertebrates? And I'm using, so not just pollinators here, but about all the invertebrates. Well, as E.O. Wilson said, they're the little creatures that run the world. And so we get a lot of services, decomposition, really important. We don't think about these things, biocontrol. They're the base of many food chains. A group did a study on Carolina chickadees, and they wrote a paper on this, and it was, I think, somewhere about 20,000 caterpillars were brought up to fledge, I don't know what, 4 or 5, nestlings through to flight, 20,000 caterpillars. So somewhere around 95% of terrestrial birds rely on invertebrates at some stage in their life. And then finally, pollination services. So Xerces works in the area of conservation, advocacy, research, and outreach. Outreach is something that I'm obviously doing right now. In terms of conservation, we work with federal, state agencies, private individuals, farm organizations to try to improve the way they're working so that we can protect our invertebrates. And in the 50 years that Xerces has been around, we have restored and protected 3.5 million acres, more than that now. And in addition to that, have improved management practices on tens of millions of other acres of land. So why do we care about pollinators? Well, have any of you ever eaten sunlight? I don't see any hands going up. No, you haven't. So hold on a second. I think I just jumped too far here. No? Okay. So plant reproduction is something that 85% of plants require a pollinator. And if you look at the numbers, there's something like 375,000 species of plants of all kinds. That's 2/3 of plants on Earth that require a pollinator, some kind of pollination service. And it ends up that something like 85% of that is done by insects. And you might think, well, what about hummingbirds? Well, if you look at the entirety of vertebrate pollinators, it's only something like 1%. And 2/3 of all plants. So why might that be important? Well, what do we get from plants? Oxygen. That's kind of important. So, this really is, this is a serious business. So we all learn that the way you eat sunlight is by eating something that eats sunlight. And the only thing that can do there are plants. And so how that energy moves into the food webs are in ways like this. Now, food production, there's a figure that's tossed around, and it's a reasonable number. 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food and drink are from crops or plants that require a pollinator. And globally, that's around 1,200 plants or crops. And, if you look at the value now, it's probably $1 trillion worth of agriculture that we're getting just due to these pollination services. Sometime back, Whole Foods did a demonstration for their customers to show how important pollinators were. So this is a produce area at one of their markets. And what they then did is they took away the produce that required a pollinator. And so what you end up with is something that looks like this. And it's not bare. Right? I mean, if you like oranges, a lot of citrus is selfing. which means it doesn't require a pollinator. Some apples are, Bartlett pears are, and they probably grow more than those than anything else. But, you know, I don't like that picture myself. They did the same thing on the dairy aisle. And if you look here, nice and full, this is what it looks like after you take away something that requires a pollinator. And you might be wondering, what the heck does this have to do with bees? And the answer to that is one word: alfalfa. The alfalfa is usually in rotations and they have to reseed. And so you need pollinators to set seed in alfalfa. And then there's other things we get, right? We get enrichment, you know, cultural value, things that mean something to us. You know, whether that's flowers in the springtime or, you know, picking berries like a little slave, like I was when I was a kid. I didn't have a choice. It's like go out and pick berries and then get stung by yellow jackets. But, you know, hey, they bring us all these things, right? I want to talk a little bit about pollinator diversity. There are 6 main groups of pollinators. So butterflies, moths, flies, wasps, bees, and then finally beetles. Now, all of these can be important in certain contexts. So for instance, flowers that bloom in the night, things that we don't normally notice, they're heavily dependent on moths. And they're really fairly understudied because it's hard to do so at night. Flies are important pollinators at high altitudes and high latitudes because they can fly in fairly cool weather. Wasps, they're really, for the most part, occasional, what I would call occasional pollinators, somewhat like butterflies. They're not there in a way that is the most efficient for pollination, but they do some pollination. And then finally, beetles, they're very important in tropical areas. So they have their roles in their own systems. And I want to say something I forgot to say earlier. Most of what I tell you tonight is going to be true. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm a pathological liar. I'm saying that because nature's really complicated. And so, you know, I'm going to make some generalizations and I'm going to say some things that might not apply to every bee in the world, et cetera. So now I want to point out a few things. Sometimes people have difficulty in knowing what's a bee and what's a wasp. So if you look here on the left-hand picture, there's a bee, and typically they are hairier. A lot of times you'll see some pollen being carried somewhere. They hold their wings folded over their back. That's when they're landing and nectaring or gathering pollen. If you look at the wasp, you'll notice it doesn't look like it has hardly any hair on it. You have to really get it under a microscope to see the hairs. The wings, for the most part, are held open, like a V angle. And they've got a more angular body. If you look at the rear legs on this thing, you look on the right-hand side there, they're little chicken legs. You look on the right-hand side, now there's a lump of pollen there that's made it a little bit complicated, but it's a much more robust leg on a bee. And so these are ways you can tell immediately what you're looking at. When we look at flies, now you might think, well, I'm never going to, mistake a fly for a bee, right? Well, don't bet on it, because there are fly mimics out there that intentionally look like bees. And so when you run into this situation, you got to look at some key indicators, one of which is the antennae. Now, if you look at the bee, fairly long, typically elbowed antennae. If you look at the fly, notice just little stubs. So right here, notice how small that is compared to that. The other thing is the eyes on a fly. I got to remember to talk in the mic. Those eyes are much bigger. They, on some flies, actually almost touch on the top of the head, which you'll never see that on a bee. Now, bees in general are the most important of these pollinator groups that I talked about. And by the way, I should point out, bees really are wasps. I don't know if any of you know that or not. Bees are just a highly derived wasp, and they belong to a family called, it's not a family, but a group called Anthopoda, flower loving. And they're vegetarian wasps. They had an ancestor back a long time ago, 125 million years ago, that started to develop a taste for pollen. And they went from being carnivores over some, period of evolution to being vegetarians and eating pollen. But we're going to call them bees because everybody else does. So they've got some distinct behaviors, and this is why they're such important pollinators. They collect and transport pollen. They forage in the area around their nest. So they're what's called a central area forager. And if you start to think about it, that makes pollination a little bit more efficient because they go back to these plants around and around. They exhibit something called flower constancy, and this is really important. This really is one of the main things that sets them apart from some of these other groups. They have a tendency to go to the same flower on a foraging bout. Now, it's not 100%. They can, wander off and try something else, but they learn how to work with these flowers. And, it's complicated, and I'd like to talk about it, but I don't have time to do that. But you have to trust me. There's some motor skills that go along with handling certain kinds of flowers. And so it's in their interest to keep going to the same flower. And so this is something that Aristotle noticed in the 4th century BC with honeybees. He was a pretty astute observer, and he noticed they keep going to the same place. And he wrote about that in one of his books, which I don't know the name of, Scrolls, whatever it was at that time. And then the final thing is buzz pollination. And I was talking with some people earlier, buzz pollination, there's certain plants like solanaceous plants, so tomatoes, tomatoes, something that I don't like to eat. That's why, eggplant. That's why it wouldn't come up. Tomatoes, eggplant, blueberries, they've got an anther. That's where the pollen's at. And a lot of times the pollen's on the outside of the anther, but they've got something called a porcital anther. And it's kind of like a salt shaker. If you hold a salt shaker upside down, you'll lose some salt, but pretty soon nothing comes out, usually. But if you start shaking it, it comes out. And that's the way these anthers work. And so the bees actually bite in to the stamen and vibrate, and that anther starts going, and the pollen comes out, and they catch it on their belly, actually, usually. And so this is another thing. And so honeybees can't do that. There are other bees besides bumblebees mainly, but there are other bees too that can do it, but not honeybees. So they've got to have these alternative pollinators for some crops. Now I want to just talk about how pollen's carried. There's 3 major ways, one of which is on the hind leg, on the tibia. And I'm going to show you, sorry, I'm going to lose the microphone. I'm going to show you on my femur, but what they've got is long hairs around here that come out, and it makes a basket. So they gather pollen, they mix just a tiny little bit of nectar with it, so it sticks together, and they start packing them. And so you can look here, they pack a lot of pollen. Now, when I'm doing my bumblebee atlas, we actually catch them and chill them down so they're motionless. And then I put them on a little lazy Susan table, and we've got to take real close-up photos. And, there's unbelievable sizes of pollen wads on these things. And sometimes I accidentally knock them off, and I feel really bad because they go through a lot of work for this. And they probably fly to one side like this without the weight. I don't know. But, and then we release them after that. So that's one way. The other, which is very common, is what's called a scopa. And a scopa is like a brush of hairs, kind of like a bottle brush. Very dense hairs. And here they're taking dry pollen, not with nectar, and they're just shoving it into those hairs. And the hairs are so dense, it sticks in there. And so if you pay attention next time you're out in your yard and you see a bee, or what you think is a bee, try to see which one of these methods the bee is using to carry the pollen. Okay. Now, the males aren't going to be doing this, it's the females. But for the most part, that's what you're going to be seeing working the flowers anyway. And then finally, there's a family that carry that pollen under their abdomen. And again, their scope of it, they're a little bit different. Each one of those abdominal segments has got a stripe of hairs, and they pack that pollen into those hairs under there. This is a leaf cutter bee. And so this is one of the things you'll see. And once they get loaded up, they tend to walk around with their abdomen up in the air a little bit, so they don't knock that off. So when you have a bee out in your yard, pull up a chair and just sit and watch and enjoy a little bit. Right? See what they have to teach you. And then there's one final way, a fourth way, not real common, but they'll carry it internally. And in that case, they mix it with quite a bit more nectar, and they swallow it, and they've got a crop like a bird. And then it's a honey stomach is what they call it. And then they can regurgitate that back when they get to their nest. This is what most people think about when you say bees, right? Honeybees, we all know what honeybees are. These are really not typical in a number of ways. Number one, they live in huge colonies, maybe tens of thousands of individuals. If you went out to start a hive, typically the starting size, I think, is 10,000 bees roughly in a queen. And they're non-native. They're from Europe. Colonists brought them over, and they in some ways compete with our native bees, but they're really important. And we're not going to talk about them because at Xerces we really focus on native bees. That's our thing. Well, natives, I should say, not the species. So, before I leave honeybees, very important, incredibly important pollinators in some cropping systems. You've all heard about colony collapse disorder and things like that. So there's been some problems, lots of pathogens that they've got to fight off. And I'm just going to leave the story right there for honeybees. So let's talk about our natives. Most of them are solitary. 90% of our native bees are solitary. That means the females build nests on their own without anybody's help. Now you look at I lied, see. Now, if you look at a honeybee queen, I'm just going to say honeybee one more time. If you look at a honeybee queen, she's got thousands of workers to help, right? So these females, they're doing it all on their own. They're very gentle. They don't have a colony to protect. So, the only bees that really get angry are colonial. And so bumblebees, if you poke your fingers down in a bumblebee nest, that would be a problem. And the same with, say, honeybees. It's hard. In fact, there are bees called mining bees, and kids call them tickle bees. And you go hold them in your hands. Now, if you look in the world, there are roughly 20 to 25,000 species of bees, depending on who you ask. And those would include undescribed species. So what that means is they've collected something, but a taxonomist hasn't gone through this rigorous process of actually describing all the nitty-gritty little details. In the North America, north of Mexico, roughly 3,600, maybe 4,000 different kinds of native bees. Oregon and Washington, probably the 600 to 800 range. Washington on the low end of that. And a city the size of Portland, maybe 100, 150 species. And then your own yard, depending on how good a pollinator habitat you have, you could have 30 or 40 species of native bees. Some of them you wouldn't recognize as bees. I'll show you an example here. So one aspect of diversity is just the size difference. And this brings up what I just said. Some of them you wouldn't recognize. That this big black head belongs to a carpenter bee. It's about 1.25 inches long. And the little bee next to it is called a Perdita minimum. Some people call them fairy bees. And you can see, you could take several of those individuals and stick it inside of one of those eyes on the carpenter bee. So if that little Perdita was on a flower in your yard, chances are you'd think, oh, it's a little bug of some kind, right? You wouldn't recognize it. No, it's actually a bee there. Oh, and then I want to point out one thing. There's one other difference between bees and wasps. And you don't usually see this when they're out on a flower, but I'm just going to tell you anyway, as a point of reference, is if you look right here, you see these hairs, can you tell that they're kind of branched? Right? So bees have got branched hairs. It helps with pollen, okay? For pollen to stick. Wasps do not have branched hairs. So when I'm doing collecting for the Oregon Bee Atlas, unfortunately, those bees are sacrificed. And I've got, one of the things you do, you look under the microscope, and once in a while you'll have a specimen that it's not obvious whether it's a bee or a wasp. There's some bees that really don't look like bees. And one of the things you do is you crank up the magnification and you find a hair and, see whether it's branched. So these are some common Western bees. Now, it's interesting that we know surprisingly little about the lifestyles, the ecology of these native bees. We don't really know for sure how many native bees are in Oregon. And Oregon is kind of advanced in that the Oregon Bee Atlas has been going for, 4 or 5 years now, gathering data. So we're like ahead of the pack in that. But it takes a lot of time to go out and study the actual ecology, how these things live. Let alone what does the nest look like under the ground, for instance. Okay? If you look at these pictures, these are examples, they're not to scale, but there's just some examples. This is really common. You'll see these things that you're looking at, Boston Sensky's bumblebee. This metallic green sweat bee. This is another common one. Some of them are entirely green, come out a little bit later in the summer. This one here, I can't get it down to one, but the cuckoo bee, just a little aside, and I'll try to make sure I keep to the time on it. But a little aside, a cuckoo bee is like a cuckoo bird. Well, what do cuckoo birds do? You're an Audubon group, you got to know this. Right. So they go and kick the old eggs out and put their own in there, right? That's exactly what cuckoo bees do. They find a nest, they invade it, they kill the egg. If they can't find an egg or a larva, they lay their own egg anyway. And that larva is a really mean little thing that comes out, the cuckoo bee larva, and it kills anything else that's alive in that cell. And so that's why they're called cuckoo bees. One last thing, these are pretty common, small carpenter bee, the same family as that big black one was, but this guy's less than 1/2 inch long. And you'll find them around if you look for them. Another one of those leaf cutting bees that carries a pollen on the bottom. So we've got work underway in various places to try to understand better what we have. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the natural history of bees. That means, what do they do for a living? Now, this is a typical solitary bee life cycle. Adult bees are alive maybe 2 to 4 weeks. The males maybe less than that typically. The females can go 2 to 4 weeks. And this is a mining bee, ground nester. And so what she's going to do is she's going to go and create a cell, a brood cell. And if you look at this cell on the bottom, that's a lump of pollen. Some people call that bee bread. And that'll be pollen and a little bit of nectar. If you look at the cutaway, it looks kind of waxy on the back. So a lot of bees will put glandular secretions or plant resins or something on those cell walls. They can be both for waterproofing or antimicrobial properties. So once she's done this, then she's going to close that brood cell up. She'll lay an egg first, sorry. And, depending on the species, 1 to 3 weeks later, you're going to have your first larval instar break out of the egg. There's 5 larval instars on insects, or on bees, I should say. And depending again on the species, that can take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. It's temperature dependent, et cetera, et cetera. But finally, we get to where the bee is going to pupate. It's going to build a cocoon, somewhat like, think of butterfly cocoons. Well, a lot of insects use some kind of a cocoon. So the bee is going to be in this and spend, 8 to 9 months. So you go think about this. This bee that you see in June, it's only out up above for, like 11 months. Almost all the year, they're underground, out away from our view. We don't know they're there. That's one reason to be careful. If you've got habitat that you set aside for ground nesting bees, don't go take the culprit, don't take the rototiller in there the next year, because they sometimes don't come out until the next August or something like that, right? Be careful with the shovel. So ground nesting bees are 70% of those natives that we have, and they need access to soil. There's many things I can say here, but I'm just going to keep it simple. They look like little ant nests, and sometimes they're in large aggregations. So you have hundreds of these things in like a square meter of good soil, good for them that they like. And sometimes not so many. And it'll look like an ant nest. And the only way you can really tell is just stand there for a minute or so. And if you don't see an ant, then the chances are it might be a ground nesting bee. Now, on the far right-hand side, you see some other examples of ground nesting bee architectures. The first example was a single brood cell. And here we've got multiple brood cells and one very complicated, almost like a condominium. And so what this is on the bottom right is a shared entrance, that individual, almost like a condominium. So the solitary bee females have their own little section in here, and they know their section. They can sense their, pheromones that are left behind. And so this, is like a communal situation. Well, these configurations vary by species. So, if you do the math, let's say 600 species, 90% or say 70% are ground nesting, you probably have a whole bunch of different ways that these things look.
Deep with that complicated structure be in the ground?
This complicated structure, they're typically, in general, and I'm not talking about the complicated structure, but in general, they're going to be 12 to 18 inches deep, sometimes shallower. There's some bees in really dry habitats. There's one bee in Arizona, in Australia, that has been recorded to be something like, let's say, 8 or 9 feet deep. And so it varies, but these complex ones, not so much, 12 to 18 inches. So the other 30% of our bees are kind of cavity nesters, and they'll use, if there are existing holes, cavities, they'll use like beetle tunnels in wood, they'll use that. Some plants that have got a really pithy stem, so it's soft and the bee's able to dig out a little bit. There's some bees that can go and deal with that. And if you do a cutaway on one of these stems, what you see is a linear series of brood cells. And so they start at the back and they provision the cell, lay the egg, put up a separating wall. They continue the process. They start with females, and then typically. Start with females, and then they end with males. And why would they do that? Because from an evolutionary perspective, from a fitness for survival perspective, right? So what if you lose the males? Right? They're not carrying on the next generation. We're indispensable. Sorry, guys, for this. If you look at that middle picture, isn't that an interesting looking? What do you think makes that color? Now, these are leaf cutter bees. I forgot to tell you that. It may be obvious. Those are farewell to spring petals, right? Clarkia amina. And this particular Megachilles, the genus of this bee, leaf cutter, they like to use Clarkia petals. And this lining, there's been some studies that show probably the purposes, one of the purposes of this lining is antimicrobial, again, properties in the leaves and material that they're bringing in. And not unlike the linings that you're seeing in some of the ground nesters. So we talked about, leaf pieces. Some bees use pebbles and plant resins to create a little place to build to provision their cell. So this is a little single chamber, very small. You can't tell from the picture. There's a little scale there. That's like a 1 millimeter scale. So, we're talking something that's, half an inch across or something like that in diameter. Of course, mason bees, you've all heard of mason bees, and they use soils. And then finally, there's some bees called Carter bees, which use plant hairs or trichomes. And this is a plug of trichomes that's been pulled out of the cavity. It's about a half an inch across. And in the center there is where she's going to provision and lay her eggs. Now, I want to talk about bumblebees real quickly. Bumblebee life cycle. We have hibernating queens. So last year's queen goes into hibernation, usually in either loose soil or under leaves. That's one of the reasons we tell you to keep the leaves until, say, March or something like that, depending on the weather. They come out in the spring, much like a grizzly bear. They fattened up before they went into hibernation, and they burn through all those energy stores. And so they've got to get to the nectar of the plants, and that's what they do. And they also start looking for a place to build a nest. We've got some that nest above ground, some that are cavity nesters. In our area, underground cavities. In our area, most of them are cavity nesters. But somewhere, this queen is going to go and find her a place, and she creates a big ball of pollen, and that's this thing a little difficult. On the right-hand side, or sorry, the left-hand side, on the bottom below this queen is that pollen ball. This is a nectar pot, and she builds that out of wax. She fills it up with nectar. Right? Now, she got her pollen and her nectar. She lays her eggs. She incubates them, not unlike a bird. And that takes 5 to 6 weeks for those larvae to hatch into adults, turn into adults. And the reason there's this nectar pot is because she doesn't want to leave them. Because a couple of things can happen, right? Number one, something could get in there, they get cooled off and they don't develop as quickly. But most importantly, something might eat her when she leaves. And then that colony is gone. So once she has workers, then she's going to stay inside. And we're going to go through multiple generations like that. Somewhere, maybe, again, species dependent, altitude, different things make this vary, but 10 to 15 weeks, something called colony changeover is going to occur. And this is when the queen decides to start creating reproductives instead of workers. So no longer will she be creating worker bees when she lays eggs, but these are going to be drones, and they're going to be next year's queens. They'll be physically larger. They're going to get fed more, and they will come out. They'll, multiple hives or colonies around. The male and female will find each other. They'll mate, and after that happens, the males go off, and they live until maybe the first frost kills them, or they run out of flowers. And you'll see them at the end of summer. Males, now I can't really explain very easily how to tell them. I can tell them in an instant when I look at them. But they hang around. They just kind of lazing around on the flowers, drinking some nectar, kick back. The queens are larger and they're really active because they are going at it, trying to build up their fat bodies that are in their abdomens so that they can survive hibernation. If they don't get fat enough, they don't get heavy enough, they won't make it through the winter. They've got to do that. And then the cycle repeats itself. Now, these are the kind of habitat areas bumblebees like, especially an old abandoned rodent den. It'll have some insulation in it, usually fairly protected. And, if you look at the picture in the middle there, it's, it seems a little overgrown. But that's what bumblebees like. They like to have their entrance hidden. So they like to drop to the ground and kind of just go crawl in to where the entrance to that colony is. And that way other animals can't see them. Because if you think about a bumblebee colony with maybe 100 or 200 individuals down in there, there are larvae. That's a really rich source of food. Skunks get into these, are a main predator for colonies. Some bees nest on the surface, like this picture on the right. And this is typically in a big clump of grass. So they're kind of hidden somewhat. Now, when it comes to flowers and nectar, bees are not picky, like most pollinators. Sugar water, sugar water. And they'll visit a wide range of flowers. When it comes to pollen, what they're feeding to their larvae, they can be very much more picky. And so there's this term called lecty, which is kind of like how picky you are with what you're feeding. And polylecty means you don't really care. You can go from a wide range of plants. Sometimes we say these are generalist bees. And on the other side, there's oligolectic bees, and they maybe will only use pollen from one family of plants, or sometimes it can even get down to a genus or a species of plant. And that can be kind of a risky thing, for reasons that you could probably guess. Butterflies, are very much like bees in terms of life cycle. The difference is butterflies lay eggs on a host plant and they just take off. That's it. The eggs are on their own. They're not hidden. Then maybe they're on the lower surface of the leaf, but that's about it. But they need these host plants, and they're very specific, kind of like bees and pollen. The same thing with butterflies. And about monarchs and milkweed. Well, that's not an unusual thing. That's the usual situation, right? You start looking at butterflies, you'll find a lot of them have specific host plant needs. So I already said this. And just to make sure everything is clear, when we talk about host plants or nectaring plants, again, they don't care what the nectaring plant is. But host plants is a totally different story. They won't lay their eggs on something that they're not adapted for. One other difference is that butterflies can overwinter in the egg stage. And you'll never find a bee overwinter as an egg. There are some bees that overwinter as adults. So I showed you that picture with the pupa that doesn't, where there's an emergence for 1 month on that female. Sometimes there's actually an adult sitting underground waiting. Those tend to be springtime emergers. So I want to go back to these caterpillars here. And I want to go back because you're Audubon people and you're going to appreciate this. Or most of you. Maybe some guests here, and that's okay too. So what we're going to learn is that caterpillars transfer more energy into the food web than any other animal. Again, this is one of those things I warned you about. That is generally true. And it depends on the eco region, maybe. But this is generally true. It's certainly true in the temperate areas where we live. And second thing, most birds forage within 50 yards of their nest. And that's obvious because they don't want to go too far away. And they only do that if they have to. They want to protect the kids. So if you add 2 and 2 together, what do you have to, add one, add these 2 things together. What is it that you need to do if you want to have more birds in your yard? Get some host plants for butterflies and moths. So you've got caterpillars because that's what they need. Right? You want to make a welcome home for them. I'm going to talk about threats here. We've got habitat loss. I'm not going to say a lot about this. We all understand how this works. Pictures say it. And the Xerces blue butterfly told the story about habitat loss. Pesticides, second among the top 2 threats. So habitat loss, pesticides for pollinators and insects in general, invertebrates in general. Every year we apply more than 1 billion pounds of pesticides in the United States. And when I talk about pesticides, this gets used incorrectly sometimes. This is an umbrella term. So this includes insecticides, miticides, herbicides, fungicides, any other kind of sides. One of the most egregious uses of pesticides actually is in our urban landscapes. You might think, well, it's the farmers that are doing all this stuff, but no, back off, because farmers don't put down more than they have to, because they got to pay for it. And they read the labels, they have to. There's rules around this. But, us folks out in the suburbs, we can run down to Home Depot and grab a can of whatever it is that looks like the right thing. Don't bother reading the label because, I've done this 100 times before. You just start spraying that stuff around, right? Well, that's a problem. And they did a study up in this South Puget Sound area, and it ended up that the application rate for pesticides was greater in the suburban areas than it was in the surrounding farmland. And a lot of times it's for cosmetic reasons, and we have to have a different understanding of what makes a yard beautiful. Is it a pristine flowering plant that doesn't have a single hole in it? Or is it a yard that's got some plants with holes because that leafcutter bee was using it to line its nest? And we have to think about what is beauty really. A lot of you probably remember back in 2013, I think, right? Wilsonville, bumblebee kill off. 100,000 bumblebees were killed because of systemic pesticides that were used to treat linden trees. And it got into the nectar after just 2 weeks after the application in the trunk, got up into the nectar. And they did DNA studies to come up with this 100,000 number. 100,000 bumblebees whack, and no one broke any rules. Another thing with pesticides is something that's called sublethal effects. And what this means, obviously by the name, is that it's not killing, but it's harming. And so, So I'm using just to explain to you, my fonts are off by a little bit on this PC. Now, this is not the way it looks on my computer. So I'm not that bad at my presentations. So reproductive success, that means, hey, what it says, they're pesticides for various reasons can cause them not to be as fertile, not to have as many offspring, and that's a big problem. Another issue, growth. Something like neem oil is a larval inhibitor. And so if it gets onto larvae, even in small amounts, it can reduce how large those get. And let me just back up here. And it's never a good thing when you come in as the runt. That again can contribute to lower reproductive success, but it also just makes you, less capable. Immune response. A lot of fungicides really can disrupt the gut microbiome of something like a bee. Now, we all have a gut microbiome, right? You'll buy probiotics and all that stuff to help it out. Bees have the same thing. And so fungicides kill that and weaken the immune response of the bees. And then finally, foraging. They've done studies, and small doses of certain pesticides have been shown to make bees lose their way home. They just go get lost. These are really serious things, but they're not killing. And in a sense, they're not even tested for most of the time, not by the EPA. So I want to leave you with this. This is a safe amount of pesticides. Anybody have a language here that I'm missing on here? Okay. Climate change. Climate change, really important. 20, 30 minutes of talking, so we're not going to do that. But I just want to point out there's multiple elements to it. If you look at the left-hand side, you can think in terms of this, shall we call slow climate change, even though by maybe geological standards, it's not slow, but it's still rolling out over decades. And then on the right, you've got these extreme events. And these are really dangerous because they can wipe out local populations, just boom. So if you've got a big, bad, cold storm that hits all the South California coast where the monarchs are overwintering, what do you think that does? That's a big problem. But it's very complicated. I'm not going to go on further. So I've talked about all of these threats, and what do we see then? We see declines, we see declines, we see declines. If you look over the last 50 years, there's been a 3 billion bird decrease in the Audubon bird counts, right? The annual bird count. I'm not sure which one it is, but you tell me. So 3 billion birds, and if I recall, I think that's a 25% reduction in the population. And why might that happen? Well, let's go back and think about it. 96% of terrestrial birds rely on invertebrates at some time during their life. That makes sense then. But what do we do about this? Well, that leads us into conservation. And Xerces has 4 principles of conservation. The first is provision of appropriate flowers and host plants for butterflies. Second, no use of pesticides. Third, you got to think about the habitat, not just the flowers, overwintering, sheltering, because there's other life stages you have to protect. And then finally, getting out and sharing the word or helping out in some way. Now, I want to point something out. If you're concerned about bees, don't go out and buy a beehive because you're concerned about bees. This is not bee conservation. Now, there's reasons for doing it, perfectly fine. You want to have your own honey and stuff, but don't do it because you want to help the bees, because you're going the wrong direction. So what bee conservation revolves around providing adequate habitat, good habitat. And you can kind of think about honeybee hives like this. I mean, this is really where they fit in. It's kind of this domestic agricultural, if you want to call it that. And, there it is. So what's good habitat? Well, secure nest sites. You've got to have flowers. You've got to have them over a whole season. So I didn't really point this out, but we talked about the solitary bees. I did say, 2 to 3 weeks, the solitary bees out. So if you've got flowers over that period of time, then everything's hunky-dory, right? Well, that's only one species, and it happens to be out then, but then there's another one that's going to come out in another month. And then you've got the bumblebees, remember, that are out there for maybe 12, 16 weeks. So really what we're saying is you need to have flowers, those kind of resources available from, over the whole kind of spring through fall. Natural areas, these are our go-to places. This is where everything is safe. And as you get closer to us, things become less safe for these animals. And, we end up with these unnatural areas, for lack of a better term. And any one of these could be, perfectly suitable for some species of bee. We don't really know. I mean, we have to go out there and, are there bees? Are there pollinator plants and stuff? They don't look great necessarily. And this kind of brings us to this idea of partial habitats. And if you live in town, you don't have to provide everything. If you look, oh, there we go. Right here, we have a ground nesting bee. And this path shows a circuit that she might make. And I'm not going to go through the details here, but, what was number one? Some flowering fruit trees. So these are different things that are available to her. She obviously has a place for her nest where the bee symbol was. And then she can go out throughout the neighborhood and collect the resources she needs. So sometimes if you're complementing what you have with your neighbors, that's good. You don't have to do it all. If they've got stuff that's just full of blooms in the springtime and no one on your street's got anything in the middle of the summer, then maybe you should think about putting some summer stuff in. So appropriate flower and host plants. Locally native plants should provide decor, and we're talking about maybe 50 to 60%. I don't know if you're familiar with Doug Tallamy, he's a very famous guy. This is kind of a number that he throws out. Bloom period, I already mentioned this, but again, late winter, early spring, all the way through fall. You want to support everybody. Colors, we need to satisfy our own needs, what we want in colors. But you think about the bees too. Bees have trouble with red. They don't see red well. Now, that doesn't mean that red flowers will not attract bees, because they can have ultraviolet markings on them and they can see ultraviolet. And so it's kind of floral, flower specific. But a lot of hummingbird plants do not attract bees for that reason. And the best thing to do, if you say, well, by God, I want a red plant in my yard, I don't care. You can either just get something that attracts hummingbirds or go to a nursery and find a plant and just stand around a little while. And if bees come to it, then whether you can see the ultraviolet markings or not, go with it, right? See what they like. Got to think about diversity. It's a known fact that a greater diversity of flowers, flower shapes, colors, attracts a greater diversity of insects, including bees and other pollinators. And drought tolerance. So I want to talk a bit about this diversity. If you look at this bee here, this is a mining bee, and it's got a very short tongue, what we're going to call a short-tongued bee. And now look at the flowers, and you can probably tell immediately that some of these flowers are not going to work very well, like this one here. But this one will be great. That one will be great. Let's look at this bee here. This tongue, and I've got this red line so you can make sure you see how long that tongue is. That tongue is nearly as long as the bee's body is. Now, what is that bee going to do on this sunflower? it's going to walk all over its tongue. Well, not really, but you know, pretend. So it's not going to like this. It's not going to enjoy this sunflower very much. And so we have to recognize that there's long-tongued bees, there's short-tongued bees, and so we want this diversity. And then while we're at it, picking things, let's think about the birds. What's left behind after the flowers? Can you provide something that is both a pollinator plant and something that'll leave some berries or fruits for your birds? Okay. Larval host plants, you know, I'll go over this real quickly because I already have covered this ground, but just, you know, again, make sure you understand that if you want to have a variety of butterflies in moss, you know, there are some daytime moss that you can see. But if you want to have that variety, you need to kind of have that variety of host plants. Sometimes you have to research a little bit. There's a really good book on these butterflies of the Pacific Northwest, something like that, right? Robert Michael Pyle, one of the authors, he's one of the guys that started Xerces. And it's a great book. So I want to talk about keystone plants. So this is another thing that Calamy points out. And you know, he didn't create the concept of keystone, but much like the keystone in this archway, they provide an ecological function that's far in excess of what you would think. And so if you look at something like this bitter cherry here, Prunus species, oops, sorry. There we go. 340 different species of lepidopterans use prunus across the range where you find prunus. Oak trees, it's even greater. It's like 500 for quercus, over 500. Solidago goldenrod, you might recognize this on the bottom. This is a good plant. Not only 49 different kinds of caterpillars, but also, you know, over 40 specialist bees. And remember what the specialist bees, they're the picky eaters. So these are good things to have in your yard. And we already talked about this point. Now, exotics. You know, a lot of times people, you know, think, well, I got to go pull out all my stuff. Well, no, okay, you know, let's think about it. You don't have to pull out everything. Number one, what I do is I think in terms of, is there any benefit in the plant before you think about removing it? Is it a pollinator plant? Do the bees go on it? If the answer is yes, okay, don't get hasty. Think in terms of, can I add some natives, right? So again, this is from Doug Talamy. It's not the presence of exotic plants that are the problem. It's the absence of native plants that's a problem. You just have to keep that in mind. So don't go rip everything out. You got to think through things. I want to talk about double flowered varieties. So these are plants that have been bred over, you know, some of them over many years, centuries, in Europe, to develop characteristics that people consider important. Not necessarily bees, they're the pollinators. So if we look here on the bottom, this is a wild rose, Nootka rose, and it's eventually, you know, it or something like this is eventually turned into what we see on the top. And what happens is there's mutations that create where the stamens turn into petals, and they collect those, right? Set them aside, crossbreed them, etc. And you know, look at that top rose. So we've got a syrphid fly, a little flower fly on the bottom here, and how is that, or say a bee, going to fit into the rose on top? Provided there even are any anthers. So sometimes they totally lose those organs. How's it going to fit in? They don't carry little crowbars around, right? So these are just, stay away from those if you can. Now, if you love your, you know, prize roses, keep them in there. Just find a native plant to offset it. Butterfly bush. This is the plant that I love to hate. You know, they keep pushing these things, and it drives me nuts. They're on the, most invasive list of the Pacific Northwest Pest Plant Council. There's only one butterfly out of, 725 species, I think, in the US that actually uses this as a larval host plant. Now, that's not the same in Europe, but here. And so, butterfly bush. Now, I will say there are some sterile cultivars, which might take away the invasive part, but I've also heard anecdotally that can go away. The plant reverts after a few years. That's right, I've heard that from multiple people. I haven't read it in the paper, but there are gardeners like people, and I kind of trust them. But why not just put in something like this, ocean spray? So it's a nectar and larval host plant. And that's a great plant, long flowering. Tropical milkweed. This is something that you probably wouldn't get it to grow here out in your yard over the winter. It'd die off. But just in general, stay away from this if you ever see something that says tropical milkweed. Not going to go through all the details, but since it's not really relevant here, but there's a parasite that it can harbor called OE. And it's a big old long name, and I can never remember what it is, so we can call it OE, like all the scientists do. And what it does basically is this. So this is a monarch that has OE. And I don't think it's going to fly very far. Right? And that's pretty tragic. And so that's one of the reasons that's in here, but in a really cold climates in the winter, I don't, worry about talking about it. So just to reiterate, native is best. Coverage, if you recognize the plants going from left to right, we're talking about late winter, spring, all the way through fall. Lawns. There's a famous bumblebee scientist called Dave Goulson, named Dave Goulson, and he wrote a book a couple of years ago called Silent Earth. One of the chapters was called Lawns, the Green Desert. And I thought, well, now I'm going to make a slide out of that because I really like that concept. Because we know that lawns aren't really providing anything, right? So in the US, there's 40 to 50 million acres of lawns. And if you rank that by state, that's like a state the size of North Dakota. That's our lawns, unproductive. And why do we do this? Well, it's our heritage, right? It goes back to Europe. Why not do something like an eagle lawn? So I love this lawn on the top. It's great. Or this little meadow, and then, these little, they call them pocket meadows sometimes. You can make a really nice little meadow in a yard. It doesn't have to be large. Or you can apply benign neglect. So this is a section of my front yard, and this is middle of the summer. And you've heard of no mow May, right? Well, I do no mow summer. And my wife hates this time of year because she says, well, what are the neighbors going to think? And I say, well, I don't care what the neighbors think. I'm worried about the bees. And so we get along mostly. And but you can go a step further, and I did this last year, just yank some of that lawn out of there, just grab something and start tearing it out and put a bed of native plants in. So I've got Oregon sunshine here and coyote mint. And there's a little manzanita that's kind of in the picture. Pesticides. So let's go back. Avoid using them if you have to do it, because, hey, we all have to live, we've got situations, right? I'm not going to say that no one ever uses pesticides. You got to use it, minimize it, absolutely minimize it. Never spray on flowers. Remember the ground nesting bees, don't overspray what your target is. You don't want pesticide dropping down in the entrance to a nest. Think about the leaves of other plants, because leaf cutting bees will take those leaves down into their nest. That's why it's so difficult to deal with these pesticide issues, because you got to think about all the ways they can impact our invertebrates. But you need to be warned that even if you follow the labels, these things like sublethal effects that I talked about, they're not covered on. You know, when they give you a safe dose, that's not covered. Another thing, the size of the bee. Remember the small carpenter bee and the large carpenter bee? The dose makes the poison. It's much easier to kill that small carpenter bee. When they test pesticides, they typically use honeybees. Honeybees are a large bee. Right? So you got to think about all those things. Systemic, stay away from systemic. So those are the things that cause the bumblebee kill. If you're out buying plants at a nursery, ask them if they treat their plants with systemics. And if they can't give you an answer, say, well, I'm going to go somewhere where they can answer my question. And do it. Walk out, because that gets people's attention. And you got to remember that for woody plants, these neonicotinoids and other systemics can stay in that tissue for months or even years. Now it'll, decrease in level, but it can stay a long time. So if I take away your pesticide, what are you going to do? Well, there's ways to make a more resilient garden. Diversity in plants, native plants. You got to remember, you don't want to kill all your insects. Most of them are beneficial. Almost something like 2% of insects are pests. I just as an aside, I'm working on a presentation for the end of March on soil ecology and, working with native and beneficials and stuff. And there's like a ton of stuff down there that we don't even pay attention to. And it's all subject to, being killed or strengthened through having diversity of plants and things in your yard. And tolerate some damage. If the leaf cutter's using some of your leaves, so what? You're helping the leaf cutter out. And it's not going to kill your plant. Go natives. Native plants have co-evolved with the native invertebrates that we have. There's a balance there. People talk about this, arms race, ecological arms race. You might have heard that term before, or that phrase before. And what that means is that, over time, plants create defenses that keep most insects from gobbling them up down to nothing. Right? And there's this constant battle going on, but things stay in place. And once in a while, we get a native come in, like a brown marmorated stink bug. And that thing didn't grow up with our plants, and they can devastate them. A lot of our crops that we want for food, like a lot of the brassicas, they, unfortunately, they're not native. And, we got to really follow up and, make sure that they're not getting gobbled up, because they will. They don't belong here in a sense, right? But native plants help out a lot on that. So nesting, egg laying, sheltering sites, what time is it up? Pardon?
Almost around.
Oh, okay, we're going to fly. Nesting sites. Provide some bare ground if you can. Remember the ground nesters? We'll skip him. You don't need to have much bare ground. What you see here are mining bee nests. This is only about 18 inches by 18 inches. Stem nesting bees for, tunnel nesters. I've got a handout back there that covers this, how you would properly prune your plants and things for this. So we're going to skip this. Nest blocks. You can buy these things. The bottom line, or you can make them, and there's directions you can find on the internet. But the bottom line is this: if you put up these artificial nest blocks, they will work, but you've got to worry about hygiene. So you either clean them up after emergence happens in the following year, usually, right? Bleachy water, or toss them and get new ones, because they attract all kinds of pathogens. They're full of pathogens by that time. And if they get reused, there's going to be nest failures there. But they do work. And it's not only bees like mason bees and leafcutter bees, but also there's solitary wasps. And this is one that's pulling this piece of straw in. And solitary wasps are really, really important predators of insects in your yard, in your garden. So you want them there. Leave the leaves. A few people have already talked about this. And yeah, leave the leaves. You don't have to have the whole yard covered, but over the winter, you can push some outside where you can live with what it looks like. Wait until it starts warming up in the spring before you get rid of them, because you might have some bumblebees hibernating in there. You go online to Xerces, .org resources, and you click down on these. You'll find a Pacific Northwest region among others. And if you click any of these blue bars, you have access to all of these materials here that you can download. So there's a wealth of information online. Books that you can get, well, they're actually on the table back there as an example. Really good books. And I've been talking for quite a while now. Sorry about that. But I want to just pause for a second. And I promise you I'll quit talking. Nothing could be more true about pollinators than this statement. And it's really up to you what you want to have. How much do you put into? Do you want that really full, diverse ecosystem there? And that's little Cooper's down there, I believe. So we know we have a full ecosystem. And, what if you don't have a yard? What if you can't put plants and stuff in there? That happens for whatever reason. Well, there's other things you can do. So you can be an advocate. If you use social media, put some things in about the work that you're doing. Signs and notices, if you want to let your neighbors know. A lot of people like handwritten things like this for that kind of homey touch, but you can buy professional signs. There's other things. If you go to Bring Back the Pollinators, and there's a handout that covers this, and it's got some good material. You can take a pledge and sign up and get on a national map that you're going to do this. Bee City USA is something. I think Springfield maybe is Bee City. Is Eugene's doing it now? I know there's some campuses too. Yeah, it moves along. So I'm not going to say anything about that. X Kids is a really cool program. I've got a lot of. I see there's still a lot of material on the table back there. You can get involved in community science. Can't get out there and do a yard, or unable to do that for some reason. You can maybe think about Bumblebee Watch or some of these other organizations. Some of them just taking pictures of milkweeds and getting them into a database that scientists use. You can volunteer with people that are doing restoration, like land conservancies and things like that. There's a new license plate, Oregon license plate, and these are just social media stuff. I'm going to just leave you with this. It's the last one. Sign up for a free newsletter over there in the back. Thank you. I'm so sorry I went long. Bye.
No problem.
Great. So, we'll let you answer questions in the back, maybe?
Yeah.
And I do want to thank so much for coming. Yeah, it was wonderful. We learned a lot, but I know the audience loved it. So thank you.
I can't shut up sometimes. Okay, sorry.
I do want to mention our next month program. I forgot to do this earlier because Dennis usually plays that role. And I'll take this out and bring it to you. But next month's program will be March 25th, 6th, I'm sorry. And it's going to be Ron Popish again, who's a wonderful artist and biologist and theater person. And he's going to talk about drawing on nature, using his art to represent nature for many purposes, educational purposes and pleasure purposes. But so come see us again next month for Ron Popish coming here. So thanks, everybody.